Thank you for inviting me here to your beautiful country, which is actually my ancestral home, actually, because my father was a Kiwi and I'm actually married to a Kiwi as well, hence the frequent travel to the South Island of New Zealand. So I love coming back here, and I especially love today being here among a group of like-minded, family-oriented conservatives, because I can tell you that the impression that many Australians have of New Zealanders and New Zealand is that it's a socialist, progressive paradise headed by Saint Jacinda. And in fact, after our recent federal election just a few weeks ago, which the lefties were horrified by the result, because we had a Christian, an avowedly Pentecostal Christian, was elected Prime Minister. And they were so certain that they were going to, that Labor was going to win, and they were going to have a Prime Minister who was going to usher in this identity politics agenda, which is part of the platform of the Labor Party. And it didn't come to pass. So they were just frothing at the mouth, and there were lots of maps of Australia going around Twitter, and they had removed Queensland, which is our most conservative state and which really swung the election, removed Queensland and replaced it with New Zealand. So they all want Jacinda Ardern, the lefties, to come over and be Prime Minister of Australia, but I think you can keep her. So, look, I thought, since I know that New Zealanders quite like rugby, that I would start off telling you a story. It's a story I've written for this Sunday's newspaper in Australia, and I think that the New Zealand media has been following quite closely the saga about Israel Folau. So I'll just skim over the details, but he's Australia's best rugby player, or at least he was until he was sacked by Rugby Australia for posting a Bible quote on Instagram. Now, he is a Pacific Islander. I've met him several times before this incident. He is the loveliest, gentlest man, and I think you know his beautiful wife, Maria, who's a silver fern. Now, in fact, more than half of rugby players in Australia are Pacific Islanders, from the grassroots right up to the Wallabies. And so many are like Israel Folau, devout Christians. So for Rugby Australia to do this is really catastrophic for their game. And, you know, as a devout Christian, he feels it is his duty to spread the word of Jesus. And so in April, the Australian state of Tasmania changed their laws to bring in gender-neutral birth certificates and all the ramifications that involves. And so Izzy Folau was moved to post on his personal Instagram a quote from the Bible, from Corinthians, calling on, quote, drunks, homosexuals, adulterers, liars, fornicators, thieves, atheists, idolaters, to repent or go to hell. Well, that post had about 600 views until the tolerance zealots flew into a frenzy. And they will not be satisfied until they've destroyed Israel Folau, destroyed his wife, his parents, their church, and everybody associated with him. And they want their persecution of this rugby superstar to serve as a lesson to all Christians. Keep your religion in the closet. And of course, the drunks and the fornicators and the liars and the thieves, we're talking most of Australia. Strike me down. They haven't complained. They're not trying to get Izzy Folau sacked. It's only the Rainbow Lobby and those who use homosexuals, transgender people, intersex. They use them to gain power. So they have branded Folau a homophobe. He's been blackballed not just from rugby union but from rugby league. He's even been threatened with audits by unnamed tax officials. He is officially an unperson. And his beautiful wife, Silver Fern Maria, was attacked for posting a link to his GoFundMe account, to the point that ANZ Bank, which is a sponsor of Netball New Zealand, expressed its displeasure. Now, Israel Folau had turned to GoFundMe, that's the donations website, to raise money for his legal bills, because he's launched a legal action against his sacking. And this will probably go all the way to the High Court as a test of religious freedom. So really we owe a debt of gratitude to Izzy Folau for his courage and his convictions, because he is paving the way for all people of faith, and in fact no faith. It's to test our freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience. And after all, he is the first athlete in the world to be sacked for his religious convictions. So GoFundMe, they closed down his account. It had already raised more than $750,000 in a few days. And they had to shut it down because those donations embarrassed the tolerance totalitarians. They showed them that there are thousands of what we call quiet Australians who were willing to back Folau with their hard-earned money, thousands of them, not because they're bigots, but because they know where this crackdown on free speech is heading. They know that they are next. I mean, how many of these quiet Australians work for companies like Qantas, which was a sponsor of Rugby Australia and put pressure on them to sack Folau? And if you work for Qantas, you have to stay silent in the face of gratuitous corporate activism that conflicts with your private values if you are a Christian. And you don't even have to agree with Folau or even believe in God to fear a world in which you can be destroyed for quoting the Bible. And of course, we all know that if Israel Folau had instead said that climate deniers will go to hell, well, he would have been praised as a sage, because of course climate deniers will go to hell. So the good news, I think you heard earlier today from Martin Iles, that the Australian Christian Lobby came to Folau's rescue and set up a new donation site which amassed, it was at one point $1,000 a minute, more than $2 million in a couple of days before it was closed because they'd got enough money, but who knows how much more money would have poured in. And this has really been an eye-opener to these woke corporates. I've been told just a few days ago about a bank boss who, in Sydney, classic corporate type, very woke. You only get to the top of these companies now if you obey all the political correctness. And he came out and told his staff that this massive donations to Israel Folau, this was a surprise, and they should see it as an untapped market which might provide future business opportunities. So he wanted them to all go away and sort of think of things that they could sell. But the point really is that he and his colleagues were so amazed that there actually are people who exist out there who feel so strongly about freedom of speech and felt so aggrieved about political correctness that they would part with their own money to fight it. And the fact is that Rugby Australia is acting like it's the victim here, but it started this fight. It provoked Israel Folau by needlessly conflating sport with politics. That was when it became a cheerleader for the same-sex marriage cause back in 2017 in Australia. And somehow it didn't occur to anybody in the rugby hierarchy that their activism on same-sex marriage would conflict with the views of more than half their players who believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. Now, 4 in 10 Australians voted to retain that traditional view in that same-sex marriage plebiscite or survey that we had as a precursor to the legislation. And that's 40% of Australians. I would dare say there would be a lot of Australians who voted yes in that survey just to get it off the table. They believed the activists when they said this is just about equality. When it's done, you'll never hear about it again. Well, the opposite is the case. And people voted against same-sex marriage not because they are bigots. Despite the fact that the Labor leader, Bill Shorten, who, if you had listened to the media, most of the media, was a shoo-in to become the Australian Prime Minister a few weeks ago, he described anyone who disagreed with same-sex marriage as, quote, haters who come out from under rocks. So that is the leader of the mainstream alternative party who, would have been Prime Minister but for Queensland. Now, many of the Australians who voted no actually realised that marriage is just the latest proxy in the Cultural Revolution. Nevertheless, they accepted the decision of the majority, and we trusted the government to safeguard religious freedom. The problem is that acceptance is never enough for the tolerance fascists. They demand total submission. And the Folau furor is so emblematic of this war because, it comes about because a minority of Australians in influential positions, whether in business or in politics, they equate Christianity with homophobia, and they will not rest until they have stamped it out. Not homophobia, Christianity. Now, this is an untenable position. This religion whose central ethos is to love thy neighbour as yourself, whose adherents minister to the poor, the sick and the dying, the religion which underpins all that is good and fair in our civilisation, is now being vilified as an agent of bigotry and hatred. And the Bible, as we see with the Israel Folau case, is being recast as hate speech. And that brings me back to the story that I'll be writing or have written for Sunday. And suffice to say that it confirms that Rugby Australia boss Raylene Castle, in her Code of Conduct hearing, or Israel Folau's Code of Conduct hearing in May in front of a panel of 3 judges, she declared parts of the Bible as unacceptable, as hate speech. She said so. She told Israel Folau that he could quote the Bible, but only the good bits. She didn't tell him what the good bits were. He was supposed to figure that out for himself. He asked her 3 times. So Christianity equals homophobia. The Bible equals hate speech. And Christians are bigots who are responsible for the suicide of gay teens. And that's, of course, the biggest furphy of all. It's used as a weapon, always, by the Rainbow Lobby, and to shut down people of faith who might argue against these encroachments on our civilization, really. A recent article in, I don't know if you know it, the American Catholic magazine First Things, it pointed out that the most gay-affirming places in the world, Sweden and Holland, in those places you might expect that if it's true that the suicide epidemic supposedly of gay teenagers is caused by our society's intolerance of homosexuality, and it's because we're full of homophobic bigots. Well, you'd expect that the suicide levels in those countries would be much lower. Well, they're not. The suicide rates of gay and lesbian people have skyrocketed in those woke countries. And they call it, in fact, the Dutch paradox. The logical conclusion of this Christianophobic, anti-Christian, you call it, trajectory is basically it's war. It's not going to happen easily. You're not going to be able to destroy Christianity without any consequences. It is a radical reordering of our society and our institutions, and it can only be achieved through coercion and bloodshed. You just have to look at the Cristero War in Mexico in the 1920s, as immortalised in the Graham Greene novel, The Power and the Glory. And that's, priests were being shot and hanged. You had the government sending its soldiers into churches and just mowing down believers. That actually happened. And it's a historical example which should give pause to these Christophobes. So just because dishonest or intellectually feeble people characterise Israel Folau's quotation of St Paul as homophobic vilification doesn't make it so. We don't have to accept that that is the case. The Bible is the foundation document of our Judeo-Christian culture, and it can't just be recast as hate speech by a handful of entitled social justice warriors, even if they are powerful members of our woke corporate ruling class. Now, we were promised in Australia that legislating same-sex marriage would deliver equality, and now we find that this fight for equality is never-ending. And of course, equality was never really the aim. That was just the ruling class using lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender and intersex people as their latest pawns in their identity politics power game. It's just another beachhead in a cultural revolution which aims to destroy the family as the last holdout of bourgeois morality, of traditional values, and of freedom from state control. It's all about power, nothing to do with fairness. And the reason that the corporates have gone woke is because it buys them protection from their traditional foes on the left. There is this unholy alliance between the identitarian left and big corporations, and this is alienating the public big time. People are sick of political correctness invading their workplace. They're sick of it invading their sport, their families, their schools, and their private lives. And across the Western world, they note the weakness of their leaders. This is a recipe for social disruption and tribalism. And of course, the irony, as a side note, is that the antidote to this natural human tendency to tribalise, to fight thy neighbour, was always Christianity. Now, the Folau case is just one example, a very powerful one, of the challenges that we face in the West. We face enemies from within and without who want to eradicate our way of life, whether it's Islamic terrorism or the new Marxism of identity politics. Christians are now fair game for intimidation by the militant Rainbow Lobby, but they're not eligible for victim status accorded to just about every other group. There is no level playing field in my industry, in the media, between the LGBTIQ activist agenda and the desire of Christians to be left alone. And for example, when the Australian Christian Lobby headquarters, Martin Isles' outfit, was car-bombed by a rainbow activist in the middle of the same-sex marriage campaign in 2017, the police tried to cover it up. Within hours, they made the extraordinary declaration to the media at a little press conference that the attack was not religiously, ideologically, or politically motivated. They told the media it was just a simple car fire. And journalists showed none of their usual curiosity. Most journalists. The same-sex marriage campaign had so successfully framed opponents as bigots. Few journalists were game to protect the bigots because of the career and legislative punishment that would ensue. And you could see that the most powerful forces in the country were behind the cover-up. And while conservative politicians are constantly voted into office, they are so frightened of being branded bigots by the media that they're reluctant to push back against this progressive tide, especially on the social issues, whether it's immigration, climate change, abortion, euthanasia, same-sex marriage, and every other toxic permutation of identity politics. Now, Marika's done a brilliant job of explaining to you the rapid spread of gender ideology in Australia through the school system. So I'll just briefly go through Safe Schools. It's the Orwellian name for a social engineering program which pretends to be about anti-bullying for children, but it actually is a Trojan horse. It teaches children that gender and sexuality is fluid, all the nonsense that Marika just took you through in her excellent presentation. Now, that was dreamed up by a Labor government, but it was launched and funded by a supposedly conservative coalition government, with an almost entirely approving media, yours truly excepted. Safe Schools promotes gender transition without parental knowledge, and it makes the wildly, impossibly exaggerated claim that 1 in 25 children are transgender. Now, it was introduced, and then there was a great hue and cry from parents. So a couple of years later, it was defunded by the federal government, but by then it was too late. The genie was out of the bottle. There's been a near exponential rise of children seeking medical help for gender confusion since Safe Schools was introduced. We went from 0 children to 300 children in a year, every year, in just a couple of years. We now have teachers being trained to identify potential transgender children in the classroom. And experts say, of course, that that has contributed to this surge in the number of kids wanting to change their gender. So what we've seen is that injecting identity politics into the classroom is creating more problems for confused kids. And a lot of these kids have other problems. A lot of them, a significant proportion of them, have some kind of autism. Now, there would barely be a parent who would agree with, changing their child's gender. But our ability to resist this encroachment into childhood has been hampered by attempts to constrain our language and behaviour by bureaucracies dedicated to nothing but political correctness, and by a media culture which has been almost entirely captured by the left. This is why Qantas employees are no longer able to say mum and dad. It's why our language increasingly is clouded by Orwellian newspeak. It's why the media now runs stories, including my own newspaper, about pregnant men or breastfeeding men. In the headline, there's no quotation marks. It's why the British Medical Association asked doctors not to use the term pregnant women, but to say pregnant person. And our military has been captured too in Australia. We've had quotas for women and recruitment drives in gay magazines. We've had a Navy Islamic Twitter account. The Navy launched a campaign on gender equality and diversity in the workplace last year and asked sailors to paint their pinky fingernails pink. I don't know what the Chinese army will think looking at our army and seeing all these pink fingernails. Diversity and inclusion policies have embedded themselves in every human resource department, in every corporation and every government department in the country. They are weaponising identity politics. It is creeping into every aspect of our life and imposing ever more authoritarian rules and speech codes. It is a new mutant form of Marxism. Only instead of class, it entrenches the power of the elites by dividing people not into class, but into competing victim groups by gender, race, sexuality, faith. It is a deliberate ideology, and even if many of the practitioners don't have the full picture, they don't really know what they're doing, collectively they are lethal. The Me Too or Time's Up movement is another offshoot which wants to overturn the patriarchy, biology, family and thousands of years of human sexual interaction. Anonymous accusations of sexual assault now can ruin a man's career. Forget the presumption of innocence. Forget fairness. All that matters is the identity politics, which makes the woman the victim who must always be believed and the man the perpetrator who is always guilty. This has happened almost overnight. The authoritarian nature of identity politics is around the world. It is here. It is in the UK. It is in the United States, all over the West. And it's gone so far that in the UK, police arrested a woman for calling a transgender woman a man on social media. The word transgender recently has been banned by the Australian Press Council in an adjudication in February over a story in a rival publication, the Daily Mail, about a transgender woman, if I'm still allowed to say that. She was charged with manslaughter over the death of her boyfriend. The Press Council ruled that the description of the alleged killer, this transgender woman, as transgender was not relevant to the alleged crime. And who are we as journalists to argue? My newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, similarly was hauled before the Anti-Discrimination Board over the use of the word transgender in a story about a transgender woman who attacked customers at a convenience store with a machete and almost killing one man who was struck in the face. Even though this person's lawyer was using the defence that she was all mixed up from the hormone treatment, which made her lose her mind and go on a violent rampage, no, we couldn't mention that she was transgender. So the fact that journalists are being censored by these unaccountable, undemocratic quongos is a real concern. We are actually being forced to tell our readers lies. Every time I write about social issues, especially about transgender propaganda in schools, this so-called Safe Schools program, activists bombard these quongos with complaints, the Human Rights Commission, the state anti-discrimination boards, the Press Council, you name it. And these organisations exist, it seems to me anyway, purely as agents of progressive social change. Now we have people in our news organisation, whether it's for Sky News or the Daily Telegraph or the Australian or any of our newspapers around the country, their entire job is to deal with these complaints, which are expensive and time-consuming, takes an enormous amount of my time. I know any time I'm going to write a column about this, it does enter my mind. This is going to cost me a lot of time and effort to defend afterwards. And that does impose a chill on free speech, because sometimes I just think I can't be bothered and I choose another topic. And even though we invariably win, the process is the punishment. And I think the only reason we do persevere is because of the support of readers, or that my newspaper perseveres. Readers are hungry for someone, for anyone, to push back against political correctness. You know that the culture has reached peak Kafka when a doctor, this happened last year, was hauled before the Medical Board of Australia on professional misconduct charges for retweeting a tweet of Martin Iles' predecessor, the head of the ACL, Lyle Shelton, which promoted a book by Ryan T. Anderson from the American Heritage Foundation, who spoke at one of your conferences a couple of years ago. And also another tweet promoting one of my columns about gender ideology in schools. So the doctor, David Van Ghent, for promoting Ryan Anderson's book and my column on Twitter, just putting up a link, he faced a charge of professional misconduct on discrimination grounds simply because one person complained. And doctors are particularly targeted because they're the first port of call for children who might be confused about their gender identity after being brainwashed at school. And even though all the scientific studies throughout the last 50 years show that childhood, what they call gender dysphoria or confusion about whether you're a boy or a girl, that resolves with time, usually in puberty. I mean, I don't know if anyone was a tomboy in here, but that's sort of the breadth of it. And that usually resolves after puberty. These children go on to be happy with the body that they were born into, and some end up just being gay. But we now have new laws being enacted in Australia. The first set was in the Socialist Republic of Victoria, Marika's home. And these laws basically have doctors struck off if they don't immediately put the gender-confused child onto the transgender track. They get puberty-blocking hormones and then cross-sex hormones, testosterone or estrogen, to turn them into the other sex, and mutilating surgery. Genuinely mutilating surgery. The family court, up until last year, was responsible for, giving the okay to children who wanted to surgically mutilate themselves. And, every year it approved double mastectomies for girls as young as 15 so they could transition to male. Parents of children as young as 2 are seeking gender counselling now. And last year, I remember the New South Wales Education Department in Sydney just blithely announced that there would be the arrival in kindergarten of the state's youngest transgender pupil, aged 4. So the frightening concern is that children are being conditioned by cheerleader parents who get attention. And they get involved in the transgender cause. They become heroes if they've got a transgender child. And if any doctor decides to employ the tried and true watch and wait approach, allowing nature to resolve this conflict that a child might feel, now they can be charged in the Socialist Republic of Victoria with conducting conversion therapy. Because conversion therapy, of course, causes suicides, and so these doctors are effectively murderers. And parents who don't embrace their child's gender transition can lose custody for child abuse. So, almost a century ago, G.K. Chesterton, the great Catholic writer, envisaged, quote, "a world in which a man may be howled down for saying that 2 and 2 make 4, in which people will persecute the heresy of calling a triangle a 3-sided figure, and hang a man for maddening a mob with the news that grass is green." Well, it seemed absurd at the time, but he was right. We're there. And in the face of this massive social change, which is being enacted against the wishes of most of the people, establishment politicians around the world are struggling to adapt. My industry, the media, is going through its own technological upheaval, and it's been complicit in promoting political unrest. It's actually the dirty little secret of the media that it is our business model, the business model of 24/7 media, to foment discontent. The more turmoil, the higher the ratings. Business was never better for the media than during Australia's last decade of regicide, the Rudd Gillard, Rudd, Abbott, Turnbull, Morrison, hopefully it's finished now, years. And, everyone got addicted to killing seasons and regicide and turmoil. And at the same time, media companies are very vulnerable to pressure from advertisers, the same sort of pressure that caused Rugby Australia to sack Israel Folau. You might be aware, because I know you get Sky News here, there's been a campaign by a tiny group of activists. One of them's a professor at a university in Sydney, and they're on Twitter. They call themselves Sleeping Giants, and they've been targeting advertisers on Sky News with some limited success against any program or any commentator who goes against their politically correct agenda, especially on transgender issues. You add to that the natural leftist tendency of most journalists, and you get an establishment media that does not reflect the values of a lot of its audience. But, as the saying goes, get woke, go broke. The price of entry into the media game is plummeting thanks to social media and the internet, and so people are increasingly turning to alternative new media, and you just have to look at the millions of hits that Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson gets for his YouTube videos. So this massive social change is occurring. The political parties that are supposed to represent conservatives have been at best passive. They prefer the safe space of economic policy, and they run screaming away from the culture wars. Politicians shy away from talking about moral issues these days in case they get pigeonholed by the media as fascist, neo-Nazi, white supremacist, xenophobe, homophobe, Islamophobe, you name it, a basket of deplorables, in the memorable words of Hillary Clinton, which we should remember cost her the election. We get the politicians we deserve, but we also get the media we deserve. Now, the good news from Australia is that, against the odds at our election just a few weeks ago, as I mentioned, the Australian people voted in a devout Christian Conservative Prime Minister who actually invited the cameras into his Pentecostal church for Easter Sunday services during the campaign, and who says his policies are about strengthening families. We still yet to see if that's correct, but the fact that he invited the cameras in was incredible in Australia, where there's a real shyness about, unlike in America, and I think it's the same in New Zealand, a real shyness about professing your faith or showing your religion. It's a very secular country in a lot of ways. So whether Scott Morrison has the courage of his convictions will become clear when we see a new religious freedom bill that the government is proposing, which should stop another Israel-Folau situation. Well, it's promising to, but I know Martin Iles is cynical about it. So am I. But we'll see. And we'll also see if the Morrison government promotes family-friendly policies, because the people who are raising the next generation of good citizens are doing the most important job in the country. And they should be encouraged, for instance, with incentives that allow mums to stay home and look after their kids for the first 5 years if they want to. I mean, I know that's incredibly politically incorrect to say it, because I'm a woman, I'm going to say it. I mean, many more do want to than are able to, and many women don't want to send their kids off to childcare for someone else to look after, less well at huge expense, but governments everywhere are incentivising families to do just that, to outsource the upbringing of their children. And also, a Conservative government ought to be giving incentives to families to help them own their own homes, because people without a stake in a stable society do not vote Conservative. So that should be an incentive, an obvious incentive for politicians on the right. At the very least, people should not be punished for having children or having large families. We're told in Australia that we need this high annual migration rate because we're an ageing population and we're not replacing ourselves fast enough. But in Hungary, where Prime Minister Viktor Orban, against those same arguments about migration needed to replace your ageing population, he says that the problem of a declining population is only remedied by larger families and rising fertility rates. And so he's just brought in some pretty obvious policies. Tax deductions for families with children, subsidies for families buying houses, family tax benefits which start when the fetus is 91 days old, tax allowances that encourage young couples to marry, lowered utility costs, and fostering a pro-family culture. Since he's done this, Hungarian families have seen a 65% increase since 2010. You've got 5% of GDP Hungary now spends on family support, which is twice as much as the OECD average. After 8 years, there's been a baby boom in Hungary. Women are more likely to get married than anywhere else in Europe, and to marry younger, which of course increases the chance of fertility. By last year, the number of marriages had risen by almost 50%, divorces were down 25%, and abortion numbers had dropped by more than a third. Strengthening families and encouraging them to have a stake in society results in a more stable electorate, more likely to vote Conservative, more likely to push back against identity politics, cultural Marxism, victim feminism, Me Too movement, and so on, all which are kryptonite to the soul of Western civilization. They contribute to the cultural anxiety which establishment political parties around the world have either ignored, hoping it would go away, or made worse. And this is what has led to Brexit. It's what propelled Donald Trump into office. that was a glorious global revolution of the deplorables. Now, Donald Trump, I'm just about to go to America, as Bob said, to report on the Trump phenomenon and the election over there in November 2020, which I think will be one of the most important, if not the most important election in my lifetime. Donald Trump is, a barbarian. He's an unlikely saviour of Western civilization. But by definition, only a barbarian can defy political correctness at the moment. Political correctness is the soft weapon of authoritarian social control. But I don't think the solution is to elect more barbarians. And in our Westminster systems, anyway, it's nigh on impossible. But all of us, whether we're inside the media or outside it, whether we are part of this forum or just, parents with a family bringing up children, what we can do is create a climate of opinion which will make it politically profitable for the right people to do the right thing, but also for the wrong people to do the right thing. This, just to explain, is what the American free market economist Milton Friedman said. He said, unless it is politically profitable for the wrong people to do the right thing, the right people will not do the right thing either, or if they try, they will shortly be out of office. And so that's what this wonderful forum on families is all about. It was why I was so delighted when Bob invited me here and couldn't wait to get here and to meet you all. Creating the climate of opinion which makes the wrong people and the right people do the right thing. So good on you all, and thank you.